host a panel and said I had an hour to do whatever I want. And I thought all I would want to do is spend an hour with these people and probably not talk about AI. Well, maybe a little AI. I don't know. We'll see. So thank you all for joining us today. Before we introduce all our wonderful panelists, I wanted to do a quick exercise and demonstrate a collective civic activity together. So if you are able and if you are interested, I invite you to please stand. Now, while we are standing, we are going to collectively decide when we are going to sit down without speaking. We will all try to sit down at one time collectively without speaking. That was pretty good. Thank you. I want to go ahead and introduce our panelists before we get started, so we have an hour together today. My name is Ming Thompson. I'm an architect. I teach at the Yale School of Architecture, and our work is rooted in community design and building community around design through processes and through built outcomes like architecture and spaces. So we're going to have each panelist introduce themselves and share a little bit of their work.
Hi, good morning. Oh, sorry, not good morning anymore. Good afternoon. My name is Asmar Barhelumax. I am the founder and CEO of One Love Community Fridge. We are, our headquarters is in New York City. Should I talk about myself first more than the organization, maybe? Okay. So I, just a short kind of intro to who I am. I was born in East Africa, moved to, due to war, moved to Northern Europe, Stockholm, Sweden, and then immigrated again in my late teens to New York in search of better educational opportunities. And I think what has always led me in terms of my life has been the idea around like, how do you create great opportunities for people to live a better life? And that journey has been through finance and then fashion, and then now in the civic space or nonprofit space. I am a mother of two, and I'm an athlete. And now we're building One Love Community Fridge, which is a non-traditional model to addressing food insecurity through community building. I'll pause there for a second.
Hey, everyone. My name is Angela McKee-Brown. You can call me Angie. And in terms of a little bit about me, I've actually been working in the food system for the last 15 years, developing and building meaningful, just, and joyful food systems with communities. And that's ranged from supporting women entrepreneurs and launching food businesses so they can make a living doing what they love to do, to working on a project in San Francisco Unified School District in partnership with Ming to redesign and reimagine the school food system, to leading a kitchen and garden education program, really rooted in the notion of beauty, to launching my own two organizations. One is called Project Reflect, which is really rooted in systems design, but from the lens of joy and the notion of joyful design and what that means for our communities. And also my newest organization, which is Joy in Common. It's a nonprofit, and it's really focused in on thinking about the relational infrastructure that's necessary for our civic spaces to thrive. And so I come from the lens of joy, with understanding that joy is the sensation of freedom, safety, and ease. So when we understand our own joy or the joy of others, we're actually understanding what freedom means, what safety means, what ease means. And when we bring that forward in the design of our systems, and the design of our programs, and the design of our spaces, that can be transformative. And so with Joy in Common, it's really thinking about, as I shared, the relational infrastructure and how we can become more aware of our own joy and the joy of others, notice, name it, and make space intentionally within our communities for joy.
All right, good afternoon. I'm Justin Moore. I'm a program director with the Mellon Foundation, which is the nation's largest funder of the arts and humanities. But my background is actually in architecture, urban design, and urban planning. I worked for many years in the New York City Department of City Planning and then the Public Design Commission. The Design Commission is essentially the quality control department for public space, sort of regulating how public spaces get built. But my interest and background in public space and architecture was really always about thinking about, how do people connect and how do people have sort of shared spaces and experiences that, increase value in a lot of different ways. There could be economic value, social value. And so these are just a couple of civic spaces pulled that are projects that we funded at Mellon and acknowledging that civic space happens in a lot of different ways and a lot of different types of people do the work of making civic space. The first image is a Sweetwater Foundation that's on the south side of Chicago. And it's a former church that was sort of adaptively reused by architects, designers to make civic space because all the churches had sort of closed and there was sort of a gap in the community. So they thought, how do we need to build that community again? It was through the redesign of this space for current sort of civic activities. So literally the work of kind of designing and making and adapting space for people to be together and everything that comes when people come together, right? Like that exercise we all just did. The other example is, I think, a kind of a bigger frame of conversations about public space and civic space. It's a large artwork. It's a 80-foot long frieze by artist Richmond Barthé. He was a prominent artist during the Harlem Renaissance. He was a gay artist. And this is a giant public artwork that was created during the Works Progress administration, kind of New Deal era, in a large public housing development in Brooklyn. So the idea that something like public housing would have something like beauty, like culture, designed and built and invested into that space. And this is an image from people from city government, but also residents of that community that had advocated for years with millions and millions of dollars to restore this artwork in their public housing community. So yes, there's the built space, but then there's the civic action of what it took to actually maintain and care for that space. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Birgit Worster. I'm the Interim Director of Public Art with the City of Boston. In that role, I oversee and manage the commissioning of public art projects and programs, and also maintain and care for the city's public art collection. My background is in design and architecture and cultural anthropology, so I came through the work with a love of cities and how people use space and design. These two projects I'm showing today, the one on the left is a park, Madison Park Playground by artist Marlon Forrester with Studio Luz Architects, and this image shows an activation to celebrate the opening of that space. And then the image on the right is an event that the Triennial Public Art team held at the city, the Government Center Plaza by artist Adela Goldbard. So it's an activation of that space.
Hi everybody. Is this on? Yeah, okay. I turned it off.
I left it on.
I'm Megan Marini. I am a founding principal at 3x3. We are a community-centered design agency. We're based in New York City. I found my way there from a background in architecture and urban planning. And I call myself a community-centered designer because the work that we've been trying to do is figure out how we can center plural community voices that are most affected by a problem, a project, a plan within the design, decision-making, and planning process, which is oftentimes very messy. And how in doing so we can create some of the relational infrastructure, connective tissue that builds community cohesion, trust, well-being, and resilience. So some of the photos on the screen here are from work that we've been doing over the past several years with the City University of New York on a NIH, National Institute of Health funded study that's looking at how being involved or engaged in a community-driven and led process can affect public health outcomes at the community scale. And so we've been working in 8 different neighborhood parks in predominantly low-income communities to form teams that come up with, design their own programming and implement it together as a team. And so these are just some of the programs that came out of that process.
Thank you, Megan. So the Civic track is a new addition to the Yale Innovation Summit, and one of the ideas that have been posited by other groups in this track is that we aim to make the 21st century the civic century. We're living in a time of a social infrastructure crisis, and the places that used to connect us, like libraries and parks, are underinvested, are ignored, and worse, the places that most need that connective tissue, as Megan calls it, are the ones that are most ignored and most underfunded, the places where public space is missing. So we're here today to really talk about place. I know many of us in this room, I especially feel a strong sense of meaning from the place that I live and the place that I belong. So I want to begin first by asking each of our panelists to define what public space means to them in their work. What is public space, and why you were drawn to working in public space? And I'm going to start with Birgit first, please.
Thank you. Well, I think coming from the civic side of things and working for a municipality, my lens on public space is really around like how public space is a public service and can serve the public good, and the responsibility as a public servant to uplift those spaces in a way that can do the most to provide improved quality of life for residents of the city. So it's very much from a kind of responsibility as a public servant in this work. But I think on a more personal level, and as I came to this work, it was around, I grew up in more rural areas. I didn't grow up in cities. But having a love for cities and the way that public space can drive like instant communitas and collective kind of commemoration and celebration in such a beautiful way has always been an inspiration to me on a personal and professional level.
Yeah, so this was a really curious question for me because when I first thought about it, I thought about school cafeterias because within a school community, the cafeteria is the public space. It's the place where you gather. It's the place where you take a break. It's the place where you can connect with people who are outside of your classrooms, outside of your grade level. And so that's how I first conceptualized it. And then I started just kind of thinking about it through the lens of joy in common and us gathering and hosting events in public space. And what does that mean? Where could we gather? And then I was like, okay, it's places where you gather. And I was like, okay, maybe. And then I was like, well, is it places where you can gather that your tax dollars subsidize? Maybe. And then I was like, okay, so if my tax dollars subsidize it, do I wear a hat as like a community member when I go there? Do I feel like I'm in my community? And then ultimately, the place I got to is, can you use a toilet for free? And that, for me, was like the biggest clarifying point of a public space, because I was like, okay, like, there's plenty of places you can gather, there's plenty of places you can be in community with other folks, but there's very few places where you can just know that there's a restroom that you can use for free and not be pressured to buy something. And that is what I decided a public space was.
Okay. For me, I think about public space as sort of like the commons, because it's like really one of the few places that you can visibly see democracy in action. It's like there's so many different ways people use space, like either by desire or by necessity, and we all have to kind of like figure it out how we're going to use the space together. And there's all these different kind of like forms of power and authority that intersect and shape and drive how people use space. And so for me, it's just like almost like a theater, if you will, of democracy. But it also, in that, is an opportunity to create more connection, because, again, you don't have this pressure of, like, you have to buy something or get out.
Public space. I think I'm very much influenced by the town I grew up in, which was a small town outside of Stockholm in Sweden. and it was this 70s kind of project with there was no cars in the neighborhood. It's every street kind of had this shared playground, shared laundry. There was a communal space and so on. So I think I'm probably very much influenced by that in terms of work with One Love. And the work with One Love Community Fridge is like our mission is to connect, empower, and engage the community through education and providing access to fresh food and removing any stigma that is attached to food insecurity, and really leading with respect, dignity, and health. And we have two main tools, which is number one is the community fridge, and then two is using design. And what is interesting is a fridge is an appliance that is usually placed in a private setting. Many of us have it at home. And what happens when you place it in a public setting, and what happens in terms of how people interact, engage, feel ownership, feel like there's a purpose. So I think in general, public spaces for me is really spaces for people to meet, connect, feel accountability and responsibility, and feel like they have a purpose in the community.
Yeah, I agree with that point a lot for me, and I've got sort of two threads of response to this question. The first is that I consider public space as sort of a stem cell. It can be a lot of different things, right? In New York, our watershed upstate that is owned by the city, where there's acres and acres, hundreds of acres of land that make sure that our water is clean, that's a public space. Times Square, one of the most intensive, frenetic, insane places that could be imagined with lots of different activities, is also a public space. It's sort of serving these functions. But just your regular sidewalk, right? The place that is our right-of-way, our kind of true collective space, that everyone has the right to mobility, but there are understandings that the people that live proximate to it make sure that it's clean of snow and debris, and that there's this sort of collective understanding that we have to care for the spaces so that we can all have a society, right? So it can be so many different types of things, and it has to sort of reflect decisions that we make as a society. And so that's my sort of other response to the question, is that public spaces, they're a mirror of our society. I'm not going to go into the reflecting pool in DC, but I grew up in the city in a predominantly segregated black community, and growing up as a kid, where we would go to play was what we called the coal field. So it was a big vacant lot, and it used to be a coal storage yard that was just never improved. So you go to the field, they were looked like pieces of coal, and that's where we would go to play. And so, your world gets bigger slightly, right, as you get older, and we would go to other places in the city, and we'd go to other neighborhoods that had different demographics, and they had playgrounds with play equipment and green grass and lots of things. And I sort of, as a child, understood that, spaces were different, right? But they were both public spaces. They were both city-owned land with relatively similar density, right? All those things, but had a very, very different effect, right, in terms of what those spaces did and how they functioned, right? So it's a mirror, right? It sort of shows and demonstrates the decisions being made by the society and how people work sort of together or don't work together sometimes.
To that point of working together in public space, I want to think a little bit about who controls public space. So, Asmarit, you bring private appliances to public space to transform the way people eat and relate to each other. Birgit, you work in government to help communities bring artwork to life in their neighborhoods. And Megan, you work with governments and nonprofits to help build processes for people to shape their public space. So all of the work that you do challenges who decides how we get to use public space and what happens in a public space. So in your work, and maybe we'll start with Asmarit first, can you tell us how you navigate the tension between institutional authority and community ownership?
I didn't know. I didn't know there was any tension. I'm joking, but I was going to say, I think for us, because, just inherently with the community fridge, it is a non-traditional model. It's something that kind of requires a cultural mind shift because it lets go of social control and really it's about creating space that people can participate in ways that work for them and really thinking about longevity and sustainability. And again, like responsibility and ownership of the fridges does not belong to us as an organization. It really belongs to the community. So we think about partnership across on like a couple different ways. First, on like a kind of 3 level in terms of individuals, neighbors. We think about how important it is to have relationships and partnerships with local businesses. And then also on the 3rd level is like policy and also with the larger businesses too. And how important that is because again, we see, I guess sometimes solutions that are being proposed that does not connect those 3 levels. And it also creates a disconnect. So for us, it's really about how do we build these partnerships? How do we build bridges? How do we connect across? And then I think the other thing is just the reality of us. Yes, we are a nonprofit. We are a community-based organization. But we really look at ourselves as sitting on this like intersection between for-profit, nonprofit, public, and private space because several of our hosts, for example, some of them are for-profit businesses. Some of them are nonprofit organizations, some of them are schools, some of them are religious institutions. So thinking about like how do we design our solution and what we're suggesting in a way that brings people together, that would take strengths from both institutional institutions as well as like our neighbors and bring that together. So that's kind of how we've been navigating it. And some of the ways we've been doing is actually through the design of our first of all the actual fridges and the structures around them. How we design our partnerships with our food partners, how we connect different ecosystems around, our food partners, with chef, with farms, with other organizations, with other nonprofit organizations, with schools, and building out the different ecosystems around it. Because I think that's the only way to actually be able to have deep and long-term impact if we build that.
Go next. So I think this question is really at the core of a lot of the work that we do. And so I'll start by saying that I think one thing we have observed and seen is that when people feel ownership or like they have agency over a space, that they are more likely to feel belonging, they're more likely to engage in its stewardship, they're more likely to build roots, and find connection and meaning in that place. And so that question of sort of shared ownership and agency is really important to us. And, acknowledging that the role that civic institutions play in public space management and capital improvement and planning, they bring a lot of resources and support to this question in our upkeep and making sure that public space is suited to the needs of specific communities, and they're also managing a lot of constraints, whether that be and complexity, whether that be technical constraints, liability constraints. The list goes on and on and on. Whereas communities are they're juggling multiple priorities and competing uses, individual investment, emotionally or otherwise, and lived experience. And so how do you manage those two sometimes opposing forces that create friction? I think the question is, and what we see happening often is the institutions pulling away from that friction because it feels uncomfortable, where what we think that friction can create is possibility and can be productive. And so what we try to do is help institutions really and communities lean into that friction and really tried to kind of parse out that key question of like who is making the decisions here, and how are we inviting power sharing so that community stakeholders can be part of that decision making and invite them in to become sort of co-authors of what happens in that space. And so, it's a balance, and it's a negotiation to get that balance right, as in any democracy. So, we think that a nice balance is when institutions are creating the sort of container for communities to become sort of the authors of what happens, and how to kind of constantly remake how they use the space. Yeah, not a solid answer, but...
I'll hop in here as well. So I was thinking about this question and thinking about it on 3 levels. One is around the design process itself, and when you serve as a steward of the design process for a concept or a system or a space, and how it's so important to be explicit in the beginning about what is possible or what the constraints are. And not in a defeatist way or a way of saying that you can only go so far, but more from the perspective of not over-promising what is possible. And I think about the work in San Francisco Unified, it's 116 schools. If we'd said we can do 116 schools in 5 years, we would have failed in that process. The work is still ongoing today, and systems change takes time. And I think that's the hardest thing that it often is difficult to grapple with when you're in a community that has an immediate need. So you're operating in this, like the short-term solutions, the in the meanwhile solutions, and the long-term solutions. And so being really explicit about, this is what we can do in the short term, but if we can get to here, then that means we can get to here, that means we can get to here, and showing how these things build on each other. And so that way then there isn't necessarily the tension of the institution lied to me, or because of this didn't happen. It's more of just framing in the beginning the constraints. But then in addition to that, I think a lot about this work I do with an organization called Girl Trek. It's a Black women's health organization where we encourage women to walk 30 minutes a day, understanding the life-changing impacts that can have. And when I think about public space there, it's about walking on sidewalks and claiming sidewalks within your neighborhood. And though you don't own the sidewalk, but by utilizing it, you're determining what that space is. You're telling the story of that space. And that in itself is extremely powerful, the story of a space. And by the women utilizing it and defining that, that then transforms then how their community thinks about it. And then lastly, going into the idea of memories. Since I work in food, I talk a lot about food memories and how like these different memories that we have of an experience about the taste of something, who you were with, the smell of something, the design of the space, how that can really pull forward a lot of things that we can utilize in the design process, but also really help shape your connection and your identity with either the space that you're in or the space that you're wanting to create. And so memories actually, when you're in a public space, if you can pull forward a memory of a park from when you were a kid, that's going to potentially change how then you engage in that space and how you feel welcomed in that space, and also how then you claim that space as well. And so I think there's just a lot of power in terms of the memories that we create within space, the memories that we can pull forward within space, to allow for ownership of that space, which then gives you something to bring to the table when you're then negotiating with the policymakers or the institutions, because it is your space too, because you hold those memories or because you use it.
Justin and Birgit, you both represent solid, historic American institutions. And I'm curious, how do you partner with and how do you work effectively with communities?
That I think coming from the city side, that's such an important question to me, because when you're working for a municipality, there are so many layers of trust or distrust from the histories that residents have had. So I think it's our responsibility as a city to build the most transparent and equitable processes that we can for people to engage. If you're proposing public art, if you're proposing a memorial or commemorating, having a very clear and transparent and equitable process for that is the way we can build trust. Boston has the oldest art commission in the country, the Boston Art Commission, and we have meetings every month on the second Tuesday. They're open. Anybody interested in what's going on in Boston, you can attend. And as we build that, we can hopefully, as we build those processes in more clearly for folks, I think that is our responsibility for building trust. I think also through robust collaboration and partnerships, so that we're, like, to speak to what we were saying earlier, building a framework. The city is responsible for the framework that others can enter into to have more agency in that work.
Yeah, from the perspective of the foundation, again, I work for, an institution that is sort of established. Some will describe it as kind of elite or kind of in a certain space of power. It's very, very different from the space of power that most of the people that we're working with and supporting sort of sit. And so there are these big sort of chasms between points of reference, timelines, capacities, interests. There are a lot of misalignments between like how we work, which is, it's like we're like the inverse of capitalism. It's like we're like a bank basically, but it goes the other way and has all these rules and regulations that are structured by government and by quote unquote norms that don't reconcile with actual people and actual places. They just don't. And so it's a little bit to, I think, what Andrew is speaking to, like there's a factor of time that really has to be thought through. And there's work around kind of acknowledgement of past and context that isn't about necessarily having a set system or approach necessarily, but it's about just simply acknowledging what are the differences, why are there differences, and then just trying to learn and be empathetic about that and acknowledging the power dynamics that may exist, right? So our power dynamic comes from X amount of capital and/or certain level of privilege or visibility that we may have. But then we have to acknowledge that there's power that comes from people's memories and histories of a place, understanding and knowledge of a place, and doing the work to sort of translate and find what are the kind of common points of communication, common points of understanding about that gap, and seeing in a human-to-human kind of interaction, is that something that can be addressed or not? Is this the right relationship to address the question or challenge of issue? If it's not, are there other channels or paths for issues to be addressed? Right? Sometimes the right solution to a project or idea is to not do it, right? Or don't do it right now, right? And so that kind of work, it's a different kind of labor that most of our approaches are not, they don't teach us to do that, right? They think we're taught to like identify a problem, solve a problem, have an outcome, and then deal with it later. But sometimes there is a different kind of speed and kind of understanding that needs to be met. So that's one piece. And I think the other part about working with communities is to try to see if there is actually some kind of power shift that is possible, right? In terms of where decisions are made, in terms of where and how resources are distributed within whatever constraints that you have, but seeing where and to the degree possible that you can sort of shift and navigate a power imbalance that may have existed with a particular community.
Thank you. When we met up to plan this panel, Angie made a remark that really stuck with me. She said, we've become so in tune with sorrow, but we aren't creating the space to be attuned to joy. And I think a lot about our public space debates happening in New Haven right now around the use of the New Haven Green, around monuments in Worcester Square, and coming back to this idea of what if we talked about joy instead. So Angie, I'd love for you to talk to us for a moment, or others on the panel, about how we can create processes that create joy and what it looks like when a public space actually creates joy.
So one thing I want to clarify is that even with joy in common, I don't believe I can create joy. I can't make joy. I can't make you joyful. But I do believe we can make space for joy. And through that, I mean, we can, one, address the systemic injustices and harms that are often suppressing our joy are intentionally suppressing our joy. And that's one of the things that we can be intentional about within our communities, is to just address those things so we can begin to make space for joy to exist, because joy is such a deeply personal experience. As I shared, it's the sensation of freedom, safety, and ease. And so I think that one is huge, is to just be intentional about addressing the systemic injustices and harms that are suppressing and stifling joy within our communities. And then the other piece is just to call it forward. If you don't talk about something, it's really hard to know it exists. I was on a call with the First Partners Office in California around the school lunch program for the state. And, we were all coming in hot out of meetings and work and everything, and we're kind of all in a miserable, stressed out state. And we're trying to design a school lunch program for children. And how we're existing is going to show up in the design of the program. And so one thing I asked for the group was just to pause for a moment and just ask, will this bring a kid joy? And that was kind of our gut check. It caused everyone just to stop for a moment and be like, oh, hold on. I'm not designing this for, these stakeholders over here, or for myself, or for this over here. I'm designing this for a child. Will this bring joy? And just that question alone made space for joy within the conversation, made space for us to think about some other aspect of a child other than hunger or other than the suffering that they might be experiencing. It allowed us to see them differently, which then was going to change then what we put forward in policy, what we put forward in the design of the system. And then through Joy in Common and the little cards that you see on your tables here, one of the things I'm trying to do is just normalizing talking about joy and bringing it forward in our day-to-day conversations. I believe that in this country, we've become so attuned to sorrow, and that sorrow is what we know. It's what we talk about. Even when you think about our systems, we have a poverty line, not a thriving line. We've built all of our systems, not all, but most of our systems and institutions to allow us to survive, to produce adequate results. That's not joy. And so by just being intentional about how we engage with each other and what we begin to make space for and how we talk to each other, what we ask each other about, is extraordinarily powerful. And then in addition to that, I just want to note that I actually think sorrow is a resource. Sorrow and joy are two sides of the same coin. It's like the yin and the yang. If sorrow exists, that means joy also exists. And because I said we've become so attuned to our sorrow in this country, I actually think that's a resource that we can use to find and wayfind towards joy. If something is bringing you sorrow, think about the converse of that, and that's probably what brings you joy. And that is something then you can name and that you can bring forward in the design of your community spaces and the design of how, not even the design, and how you engage with your neighbor and what you see about your neighbor. And that's what we're trying to do I'm trying to do at Joy in Common, is just broaden that aperture of how we see each other and how we understand each other. So that way then we just have a deeper understanding of our neighbors, of our communities. And it's not just what brings us sorrow, but also what brings us joy, which then is going to change how we engage and interact with each other.
Awesome.
Oh, and then I think the other piece of that is what happens when joy is present, especially in civic spaces. I think people use them. I think that's a sure, if someone feels safe and at ease in a space, they're going to be in that space. And so I think that's when a signifier of joy, and that you've got to a place where people feel joy or experience joy within a space, is because they're using that space.
I want to take a moment to ask each of you a question, maybe starting with Megan. If we know what a good public space looks like, can you tell us about a time where you had an idea or a project for a public space that was a failure or something that didn't work, and why didn't it work?
Sure. So I also want to first build on Angie's points, because I think they're so important. But we've seen when we shift even just from a deficit-based approach to how we talk about what we're doing together, to a positive psychology or appreciative approach, which is based on what are our shared strengths, that we're able, even though joy is a deeply individual experience, we're able to find those commonalities that bind us and move us towards that place of joy and get us outside of those sort of narratives. And just one example is one of the programs that we did as part of the study I referenced at the beginning. which was Hilltop Headspace, and it was in a community that had recently experienced gun violence within that particular neighborhood park when we were just starting the engagement. And so a lot of the co-design that we did with this community was to process that and the trauma, the shared trauma, and create space for shared processing through arts. And we found that through that expression, we were able to get to a place where, there was a 50-year-old man who was making collages and like learning something about himself. And in the sharing of those processing, we were able to create those moments of connection and joy. And so I think it's just so important what you're bringing up. To Ming, your question about where things can go wrong. I think it's like, when you come in with a strong idea about what should happen and you just quickly learn like, okay, that's not going to work. But we also, we work a lot with, civic institutions that have strong ideas about what should happen. And I think where we see things really go off the tracks is, and Angie brought this up, is when we don't set expectations correctly from the start. We make false promises that has this effect of eroding trust and breaking trust. And trust is really slow to build, but it's really easy to lose. And there was one case, and this is like a really technical problem where we were doing an engagement around a major expressway and revisioning, and the timeline got kind of off track. And so we were doing engagement, but the feedback that we got from that particular phase of the engagement wasn't incorporated into the sort of like engineering and design track. And so when we went back in our next rounds, community stakeholders could see their feedback wasn't really appropriately integrated, and we lost trust pretty immediately. And so the rest of the project was just trying to really rebuild that through conversations, openness, transparency, and sort of adopting what I call working out in the open approach, which is like, we should just be transparent about what our constraints are so we can bring people into this decision-making process instead of kind of operating in the dark and not knowing where their feedback is going.
I can jump in here. No, I was still also thinking about the previous question because we do our work through addressing food insecurity. We're kind of tackling two big problems at the same time, which is a lot of the food that we bring out is excess food. So we are redirecting food, and we are working to address food insecurity. Two huge problems, and our approach has been to how can we break that down into actionable steps that can be taken again on like individual level, small business level, and the larger for larger businesses as well. But part of that process has also been like, how do we create these spaces there where people can participate in the ways that work for them? Meaning that, even if you're in that space because you need support, you need that one meal to get by that day, or if you're in a space where you can, sign off on a huge check, we still want to create the space where both can meet and both feel respected and seen. And then same thing with the fridges, because, fridges, again, they're in public spaces, sometimes outside of private businesses or private homes. So we want to make sure that is, people feel comfortable coming to the space, to the fridge, and taking out food, feeling welcome, not being judged. But also people might not understand the issue, might not be aware of the issue, or worried about other things, also still feel safe and actually feel inspired to say like, hey, what is that? How can I be a part of that? What can I do to support? So inspiring people in this process, making people feel that they want to incorporate this in this life. So taking small actions, that is really about kind of building habits in our communities on both ends, whether if you need support or if you're in a place to give support. And so it really becomes about building habits. And as we know, changing habits is probably one of the most difficult things to do. So joy and inspiration becomes a really, really important part, especially because we're talking about addressing injustices. So I just wanted to add that to how important that is, because I think a lot of times it's not talked about or considered as well. And in terms of a failed project, I would say, like, even in the work that we're doing, since we are constantly kind of refining, thinking about trying to respond, what is the specific neighborhood need, because it's not even about cities. We are in Seattle, for example, as well. Seattle is very different from New York, but even looking at New York, we have 2 neighborhoods that can be 3 blocks away. The need might be very, very different. So how do we stay dynamic and responsive? But I would say one specific is that we have this idea around the community fridges, because I'm thinking there might be people here that might be able to help us solve this. We have this idea around the community fridges where we really look at the fridge as, even though it's an appliance, it's a living thing, because they help nourish our communities, and we're inviting the community to help nourish it as well. So some of our latest fridges we have planters on top where we've been growing different herbs, and we haven't fully figured it out, because in some of our neighborhoods, people are taking out the whole planters. Some of them, the herbs are not really thriving. So we're really looking. It's a very technical problem, but it is technical. But at the same time, it's really about this creating this moment for constant exchange between, at the fridge and people that come in the fridge and people living around the fridge and so on. So we're trying to really figure out how to further design the fridge so that we can have these living herbs and plants on top of the fridges. So that was a long answer, but yes, I was thinking maybe there are people here that could help with that.
Yeah, I'll also go back quickly to Angie's point about joy and its sibling sorrow. One of the projects that we supported was called Soapbox Presents, and it was during COVID, during the lockdowns. It was a group of artists that had all lost their jobs because of all of the kind of performing arts industries had closed in the city. And it was a group of people that essentially said, we just can't live like this anymore. And they started doing concerts on stoops in Harlem, where many of the artists lived. And it was something that was like very organic, but it came out of this like being between sorrow and joy in a way. But what was really important, and I want to underline kind of, this panel, like innovation in public space, that space was one where that innovation, like the ideas or the kind of the impetus to act and to do something different, it happened in public, right? And there's something happening in a kind of a big macro way, like so much of our human ideas and innovation is privatized and capitalized, right? Like that's just the engine that is making like all of this go. And for this group of people, the fact that they were doing that actually in public in a shared way was incredibly powerful and generative, right? Like, a corporation with unimaginable resources could not have done that. That said, just acknowledging that there's a sort of a collective imagination, a collective like experience that is just very, very valuable and powerful is something that was there. And so, we were able to support it and sort of grow and amplify it. And it's, became very, very successful. Like if you look them up, Soapbox Presents on Instagram or something, you'll see all this, Babyface came to their concert, or Queen Latifah, all these people, to their little stoop concerts. But then the pivoting to the kind of where these failures show up then is that, what they were doing and building was within a really community-based system and kind of approach. But after it got to a certain level of success, unfortunately, it didn't matter what the community was doing, what their world and universe were in terms of certain things that the outside projected onto them, right? So beautiful block parties, wonderful experiences. They're playing music from 1920s Harlem. They're playing music from like the 90s. And, they're connecting different generations of people. Beautiful, wonderful things. Nothing wrong ever happened. But you had all these black people, mostly black people, right, congregating, and all of a sudden it's a problem, right? So police department gets involved. Where are your permits? Where is this and that, right? So it became so unwieldy that they had to raise an incredible amount of money to pay NYPD police officers overtime every time they wanted to bring their community together, even though nothing had ever happened, right? So there are these outside systems and things that people have to navigate, and it becomes these points of failures. It's not the failure of necessarily the people or what they're trying to do and trying to build. There's like a societal failure. And so we don't yet have the right tools to like have that conversation, right? About what does the NYPD need to do differently when these people are getting together, right? Instead, the way the system was working is that the people that were doing the thing, they had to change and they had to find resource and they had to do things differently, right? So there's a kind of a balance about when and where problems happen that we need to talk about too, because it's incredibly unfair to project that it's on them alone, right, to kind of solve the issues and the challenges. But they continue doing the work despite, and they fundraise and they do all sorts of things, and it's beautiful to see. But in doing that, they lost something, right? That, you know, there's kind of an energy and everything that did shift because they're spending so much of their time and energy navigating, you know, other systems than navigating like kind of the resourcing and work that generated the idea in the first place. But they are still doing it despite.
I'm going to have to jump in for a minute. We only have a few minutes left. I want to make sure people have time for questions. And just out of curiosity, for a show of hands, those of you who are thinking about a public space project in your neighborhood or public space that you want to change, can you raise your hand? I'm just curious. Probably definitely a majority of the room is working on public space projects. Great. So what questions do you all have? We have a great group of people here to help us think through maybe your own projects or how to approach. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Miara Brown, Yale class of 25, and the question that I have kind of touches on what you were talking about, Justin, which was how does the intersection between someone's place in society and public space change the way you approach your work?
Yeah, great question, and it's something I was speaking to a little bit before, like that work of navigating difference, essentially, and finding ways to educate yourself, acclimate, and do the work of translation of people's different contexts and experiences, and it's really, really challenging. Like there is, you know, I've come from like architecture background, right? There's like, I don't know if you know, like the Vitruvian man, like the white guy doing this, or there's the modular, the Corbusier man doing this. You know, there's this sort of presumed figure that we're just sort of constantly navigating, and it actually takes a lot of work to kind of shift that figure. My mother had both of her knees replaced in her 40s or whatever, so she's been had mobility issues most of her adult life, and it is incredibly hard still to navigate having accessibility. Like this room is not accessible, right? In one of the most wealthy institutions in a new building, right? So like things like that are like they're infuriating, but Angela Glover Blackwell, who's head of Policy Link, had this premise with what she called the curb cut effect. So in U.S. policy, when they decided to have an attempt toward more universal accessibility for people with mobility issues, like wheelchair or kind of walking impairments, to do curb cuts, like the little ramp in the sidewalk, right? And just saying that minimal thing, like we should do that, right? Just having the conversation with people. There is this thing that it actually is an incremental thing that can make a huge difference. And so there are all these studies and reports that, okay, in theory, the curb cut was done for the mobility impaired person in a wheelchair, and there's an image that that's who it's for, but you know who it's also for? It's for a mother of young children who has a stroller. It's also for the delivery worker who's an incredibly able-bodied that has to use a dolly to carry something incredibly heavy, right? So there are these things that the unlocking your premise that you're doing something or there's an investment for someone that is other, and to erase that and understand that it's something that is done for all of us, right? That's the big thing that is just, it's gotten so broken. And so those are the kinds of conversations and kind of translation work that you need to kind of have and do to get people to kind of understand the power of the civic, right? The power of the all of us, e pluribus unum, we the people, blah, 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 blah. Right? So that's like in the imagination as this powerful thing, but it gets unevenly applied. And so it's having those conversations to insist that be more evenly applied in the society. So it looks like lots of different things. Sometimes you could put on your technical and policy hat, like the curb cut thing, and you can make, you can do all kinds of reports and studies and whatever they need to do to make that argument. Sometimes it's a storytelling thing to have like human connection and be like, I'm human, you're human, I'm not a monster, you're not a monster, kind of conversation. But that's part of the work.
Sorry, I had some peeps that ran on campus. Couldn't do it with the sandwiches. But I'm Jason Oliver. I live in Houston and lead the Third Ward Cultural District in Houston. Listening to this last response, I'm thinking about how one of the challenges that we run into, Houston has so much space, but it's a question of who we're designing it for. It's often easy to make the case for building up public space for tourists as opposed